The Maya by Dr. Michael Coe. Chapter 2. The Earliest Maya. The Popavu, the great epic of the Quiche Maya, recounts that the forefather gods Tepu and Cucutmats brought forth the earth from a watery void and endowed it with animals and plants. Anxious for praise and veneration after the creation, the divine progenitors fashioned man-like creatures from mud, but to mud they returned. Next, a race of wooden figures appeared, but the mindless mannequins were destroyed by the gods, to be replaced by men made from flesh. These, however, turned to wickedness and were annihilated as black rains fell and a great flood swept the earth. Finally, true men, the ancestors of the Quiche, were created from maize dough. Neither tradition nor archaeology have thrown much light on Maya origins. Tribal memories are weak, and a combination of luxuriant vegetation and unfavorable geological conditions has made the search for really early remains difficult. There are few caves and rock shelters suitable for habitation by primitive hunters and gatherers, and open sites are virtually impossible to detect, especially in the monsoon forests. Early hunters. In spite of over 6 decades of research, there is little agreement among archaeologists as to when the first settlements of the New World took place. Some geologists have held that the initial colonization of this hemisphere must have been made by Siberian peoples crossing over the Bering Strait land bridge at about 14,000 years ago, during the last maximum of the Pleistocene, when sea level was far lower than it is today. Yet long before this, boats must have been available to the peoples of Eurasia, for recent evidence shows that Australia, which was never connected to Asia by a land bridge, was settled as far back as 50,000 years ago. The presence or absence of a land bridge from Siberia to Alaska is thus not necessarily relevant to the problem, for the first Americans may well have taken a maritime route. While radiocarbon dates from human occupations in Pennsylvania, the Valley of Mexico, the Andean highlands of Peru, and more recently Brazil suggest to some scholars that American Indians had colonized both North and South America by at least 20,000 years ago, many authorities still do not accept these dates as valid, preferring a post-14,000 year arrival. Nonetheless, the site of Monteverde in Chile has revealed a very early occupation of southern South America by hunter-gatherers, with radiocarbon dates clustering around 11,000 BC. There, excavations by Thomas Dillehay have uncovered a small village with houses built of logs. Wooden stakes had been driven into the ground to hold down structures. While the toolkit of these peoples lacks chip projectile points, unifacial stone tools and pointed weapons of wood and bone were part of the artifact assemblage. By the 9th millennium BC, the first Indians were already camped on the wind-swept Straits of Magellan, at the southern tip of South America. And so we may assume that primitive hunters had by then occupied all that part of the Americas that was worth inhabiting. Large areas of both continents were grassland over which roamed great herbs and herbivores, mammoths, horses, camels, and giant bison. In the western United States, Canada, and Alaska, where a number of camps belonging to this ancient epic have been located, the earliest culture which has stood up to archaeological scrutiny is called Clovis, well dated to about 11,500 years ago. If we can rely upon the remains in several slaughtering sites in the American Southwest, the Clovis people lived mainly off mammoth hunting, although in lean times they must have been content with more humble foods. These great elephants were killed with darts hurled from spear throwers, fitted with finely chipped and fluted points, from the bases of which long channel flakes had been removed on one or both faces. Clovis points are widely distributed from Alaska to Nova Scotia, down through Mexico and into Central America. They have even been found in Costa Rica and Panama. One of the earliest known artifacts from Maya country is a small projectile point of obsidian, found by a picnicking schoolboy at San Rafael in the pine-clad hills just west of Guatemala City. Even a neophyte would recognize this as a Clovis. Fluting has been carried out on one side. and the edges are ground down where the object was to be lashed to a dart or spear shaft. It is remarkably similar in outline to several such points which have been collected in Mexico, and to the smaller Clovis points of the United States. In 1969, the archaeologists Ruth Gruen and Alan Bryan discovered the highland Guatemalan site of Los Tapiales, which they excavated in 1973. It lives in an open meadow on the Continental Divide, in a cold, rainy, foggy environment, and probably represents a small, temporary camp of hunters located on an important pass. The stone tool industry is mainly basalt, and includes the base of a fluted point, bifaces, burins for slotting bone, gravers, scrapers, and blades. Unfortunately, no bone material has survived, but the site did produce radiocarbon dates extending back to 8760 BC. The kind of game that these ancient people may have hunted may be revealed by a butchering site on the outskirts of the highland town of Huehuetenango, first investigated in 1977 by Herbert Alexander. This was located on or near the edge of a large Pleistocene lake. Limited excavations have turned up the bones of at least 3 mastodons and 1 or more horses. Butchering marks are frequent on the bones, and 4 stone tools used in the process were found in situ, comprising a granite chopper and 3 unifacially worked tools. Archaic collectors and cultivators. By about 7000 BC, the ice sheets which had covered much of North America in the higher latitudes were in full retreat, and during the next 5,500 years, the climate of the world was everywhere warmer than it is today. In Europe, this interval has been called the climatic optimum, but in many parts of the New World, conditions were by no means so favorable, least of all for hunters. A fatal combination of hot, dry weather, which turned grasslands into desert, and overhunting by humans had finished off the big game. In upland Mexico, the Indians were diverted to another way of life, based on an intensified collection of the seeds and roots of wild plants, and upon the killing of smaller, more solitary animals. In their economy, in their semi-nomadic pattern of settlement, and even in the details of their toolkits, the Mexican Indians of the Archaic period were only part of the desert culture, extending at that time all the way from southern Oregon through the Great Basin of the United States, where it survived into the 19th century, and down into southeastern Mexico. It was in Mexico, however, and in this desert culture context, that all the important plant foods of Mesoamerica, maize, beans, squashes, chile peppers, and many others, were first domesticated. It seems likely that the practice of plant cultivation must have reached the Maya at some time during the Archaic period. An early generation of scholars, particularly Sylvanus G. Morley, firmly believed that the Maya themselves had been the first to domesticate Indian corn, maize. This idea was rooted on the often revived promise that the wild progenitor of maize was Teocinta, a common weed in cornfields of the western Guatemalan highlands. Whether this premise is correct is still a subject of acrimonious dispute among botanists. One school of thought, led by the late Paul C. Mangelsdorf, contended that Teocinta was not the ancestor of maize, but its offspring through hybridization with another grass, Tripsecum, and that the real progenitor was a tiny cobbled wild species of corn with small hard kernels that could be popped. Cobs of this sort have been found by McNeish and his colleagues in dry caves in the Teotihuacan Valley of Puebla, Mexico, in levels dating to about 3000 BC. According to Mangelsdorf, they represent ancestral maize. According to his opponents, they are probably Teocinta. This complex problem has not yet been resolved. Even if Teocinta, which is admittedly extremely close botanically to maize, should prove to be the antecedent of domestic maize, this does not necessarily mean the domestication process took place in Guatemala, for it is widespread in southern and western Mexico as well. Nevertheless, Guatemala, which is no larger than the state of Ohio, has a more distinct varieties of maize than can be found in all of the U.S. put together, which suggests that this must have been a very old center for the evolution of this plant under the tutelage of man. Quite probably, all the uplands, from southern Mexico through Chiapas and highland Guatemala, were involved in the processes leading to the modern races of this most productive of all food plants. It will be recalled that, according to a linguistic method of dating called lexicostatistics, the Proto-Mayan language may already have been present in the highlands of western Guatemala, and probably Chiapas too, before 2000 BC, well within the archaic span and before the most ancient pottery-using cultures, and it may have been they who brought maize and other cultigens to our area. Beyond the western border of the Maya area, the rock shelter of Santa Marta in Chiapas may record traces of this Ur-Maya group. Unfortunately, somewhat wetter conditions than those in the Teotihuacan Valley have destroyed any perishables which may have been left by the ancient inhabitants of the shelter, but nut-cracking stones with pecked depressions and pebble manos and metates tell us that seeds and other plant foods were well exploited. Other artifacts of the Santa Marta complex, including chip projectile points, choppers, and scrapers, strongly resemble those of the Teotihuacan and Tamaulipas caves, and the whole assemblage, which is estimated to last from 7,000 to 3,500 BC, obviously belongs with the Mexican archaic and more generally with the desert culture. Evidence for the archaic period is generally poor in the highlands, but it is improving in the Maya lowlands. We have some idea of what the Peten looked like then, based on analysis of windblown pollen recovered from a long core drilled into the bottom of Lake Petenchil in the heart of the central area. It used to be thought that the savannas which punctuate the tropical forests had resulted from an overuse of their fields by the classic Maya, with a consequent invasion of unwanted grasses. This notion has now been turned upside down. At 2000 BC, the Peten was like a parkland, with broad savannas surrounded by copses of oak, the tropical forest being considerably more restricted than at present, and what are now swampy bajos may have been shallow lakes. The strong dominance of forest over grasslands has been shown to have begun only with the opening of the Classic period at about 80 to 50, reaching peak intensity after the Maya had fairly deserted the Peten. The same pollen core has also provided an unexpected bit of information, namely that by 2000 BC, a little maize was being grown near the margins of Lake Petenchil, a good 1,000 years before the first pottery-using farmers are known for the region. Who were these people? If we accept the word of linguists, they could have been the Yucatec on their trek north to Yucatan from the Maya homeland. But since their sites have not been located, this is mere speculation. While some African peoples raise their crops in tropical grasslands, it is unlikely that the pioneer Maya, lacking metal tools, could have tilled these savannas. More plausibly, they would have colonized patches of tropical forests which offered good soils and the possibility of clearing by the slash-and-burn method, avoiding the open country as assiduously as did the early Neolithic farmers of Europe. Northern Belize has provided critical new data for our understanding of this shadowy epoch in the Mayan lowlands. The key sites are Colha, occupied right through the Classic period as a source of high-quality chert, and several lake islands and uplands between Colha and Chetumal Bay. There, investigations by Thomas R. Hester of the University of Texas and his associates, and by Robert Rosenwig and Marilyn A. Mason, have shown that there are two major pre-ceramic horizons. Preserved pollen shows that during the early Archaic period, from circa 3500 to 1900 BC, large-scale forest clearance was carried out, with the cultivation of maize and manioc along the margins of the swamps. A kind of index fossil for the period is the low point. This is a stemmed chert point averaging 3.7 inches in length, so large that it was probably used as the business end of a spear or harpoon rather than fitted on the end of an atlatl-propelled dart. The diagnostic chart artifact for northern Belize's late Archaic occupation, which lasts from 1500 to about 900 BC, is what has been called a constricted unifice, produced at local workshops in very large numbers, along with large blade tools and other chipped artifacts. Microware and experimental studies indicate that it was hafted and employed both to work wood and as a general-purpose digging tool. Again, large-scale forest clearance continued, as did intensification of agriculture. Two questions may be asked about the Belize Archaic. Were these sedentary villages? It is most likely that they were not. More likely, these sites represent little more than extensive, seasonally occupied camps for the exploitation of local soils and natural resources, including chert. Were these people Maya? Here we can only speculate, but the Texas archaeologists point out that there seems to be no discontinuity between the latest pre-ceramic radiocarbon dates and the first appearance of pottery using sedentary villages between 1000 and 900 BC. This probably means that we can date the coming of Mayan-speaking, maize-farming people to the lowlands as far back as the 4th millennium BC. Early Preclassic villages. Really effective farming, in the sense that densely inhabited villages were to be found throughout the Maya area, was an innovation of the Preclassic period, which lasted from about 1800 BC to about AD 250. What brought it about? Although some scholars favor the theory that it was a major improvement in the productivity of the maize plant, the adoption of the nishtamal process, which enormously increased the nutritional value of corn, may have been of more significance. Whatever the underlying cause, villages made up of thatched roof houses, in no way very different from those in use among the modern Maya peasantry, now dotted the land. Still, the evidence shows that the advance to Preclassic life did not take place everywhere at the same time. As will be seen, the Maya lowlands were remarkably backward in this respect, remaining for centuries on the pre-ceramic archaic level for reasons that are as yet unclear. The crucial area for an understanding of the early Preclassic in southeastern Mesoamerica is not the Peten or the Yucatan Peninsula, or even the Maya highlands, but the hot, humid Pacific littoral of Chiapas, Guatemala, and westernmost El Salvador, a region of winding rivers, highly fertile soils, and an extensive lagoon estuary system just in the back of the barrier beaches. Research in this zone has focused on the old Aztec province of Xoconochco, modern Soconusco, covering part of the coastal plain of Chiapas and adjacent Guatemala. There, sedentary villages were foreshadowed by the late archaic Chantudo phase, radiocarbon dated to 3000 to 2000 BC. Numerous shell middens located in the mangrove-lined estuaries seem to represent seasonal occupation by somewhat mobile, non-farming groups that largely subsisted upon hunting and fishing. The early Preclassic begins in Soconusco about 1800 BC and is marked by profound changes in settlement pattern, subsistence, technology, and even society. During this period, which lasted until about 1000 BC, settlements were located further inland and consisted of real villages, occupied throughout the year. Significantly, they were placed next to a series of bajos, old stream channels, and oxbow lakes, which flooded during the rainy season. As they dried up, fish became concentrated in these and could be easily taken. At the height of the dry season, as archaeologists John Clark and Michael Blake have noted, the bajos could have served as sunken fields for agriculture, as they retained enough moisture for a third corn crop to be raised, in addition to the two that are normal for the fertile Soconusco plain. What crop or crops were being grown to support these developments? Maize cobs are found in Soconusco sites beginning about 1700 BC, but these are from small and not very productive ears. Further, carbon pathway analysis of human skeletal material has shown that maize was not very important in the diet of these early Preclassic villagers. Gareth Loam of the New World Archaeological Foundation and myself once speculated that they might have been relying on manioc or cassava, an ancient root crop of the New World tropics, rather than maize, but the evidence for this remains elusive, and the case is unknown. From a technological point of view, the most significant innovation was the invention or introduction of pottery, which appears at the beginning of the bar phase at about 1800 BC. Although bar ceramics may well be the oldest in Mesoamerica, they are of remarkable sophistication and beauty. They largely consist of thin-walled necklace jars called tecomates by archaeologists, the remainder comprising deep bowls. Vessel surfaces included monochromes, bichromes, and trichromes, and have been manipulated by the potter by grooving, incising, and modeling. As Clark and Blake make clear, these were not mere cooking vessels. Based on forms and decoration of gourd prototypes, they were more likely containers for liquids and foods used during rituals. Then how did they cook? Quantities of fire-cracked rock indicate that the technique was stone boiling. Rocks were heated, then dropped into water contained in waterproof baskets. As Clark and Blake make clear, these were not mere cooking vessels. Based on forms and decoration of gourd prototypes, they were more likely containers for liquids and foods containing rituals. Then how did they cook? Quantities of fire-cracked rock indicate that the technique was stone boiling. Rocks were heated, then dropped into the water contained in waterproof baskets. Bar also marks the beginning of fired clay figurines in Mesoamerica, a tradition that was to continue throughout the Preclassic. These objects, generally female, were made by the thousands in many later Preclassic villages of both Mexico and the Maya area. And while nobody is exactly sure of their meaning, it is generally thought that they had something to do with the fertility of crops, in much the same way as did the mother goddess figurines of Neolithic and Bronze Age Europe. Pottery becomes even more complex in the succeeding Locona phase, 1700 to 1500 BC. With the addition of rocker stamping carried out by walking the edge of a shell in zigzags across the wet clay, and of striping with a pinkish iridescent slip, and true cooking vessels make their first appearance. But more significant than these is the evidence for the first ranks of societies in this part of the New World. Clusters of villages and communities were organized under a single polity, dominated by a large capital village which could have contained over 1,000 people. At one such capital, excavators found the clay foundations of a very large longhouse with aspidal ends. The floor area covered by its once thatched roof would have been 1,313 square feet. This surely was chiefly a residence where public rituals were carried out, and perhaps occupied over several generations. Social differentiation in Locona is also suggested by the burial of a child who had been covered with red pigment and who had a mica mirror on his forehead, and by figurines depicting enormously fat men, perhaps shaman chiefs, seated on stools and wearing chest mirrors and sometimes animal masks. The subsequent Ocos phase, which lasted from 1500 to 1400 BC, discovered by my wife and me in 1958, is in most respects a continuation of Locona, with the addition of a pottery decoration known as cord marking, made by impressing the wet surface of the clay with a paddle wrapped in fine cotton twine, a technique unique in Mesoamerica, but common on the most ancient ceramics of East Asia and North America. Ocos figurines are highly sophisticated, many appearing to be almost human caricatures out of the imagination of Da Vinci, but some being anatomically perfect but armless representations of beautiful young women. After Ocos, the Soconusco region was strongly influenced by the early pre-classic Olmec civilization of the Mexican Gulf Coast, but that is another story. Now, early pre-classic sites with materials and settlement pattern, very similar to the Soconusco cultures, have been located all along the Pacific littoral of Guatemala as far as El Carmen in El Salvador. In stark contrast, in spite of decades of intensive search and excavation, no pottery using village culture on this time level has yet been uncovered anywhere in the central and northern Maya areas, or for that matter, on the level of the earliest known Olmec civilization of the Gulf Coast. This is one of the unexplained mysteries of Mesoamerican archaeology. The Middle Preclassic expansion. If conditions before 1000 BC were less than optimum for the spread of effective village farming except for the Pacific littoral, in the following centuries the reverse must have been true. Heavy populations, all with pottery and most of them probably Mayan speaking, began to establish themselves in both highlands and lowlands during the Middle Preclassic period, which lasted until about 300 BC. In only one instance, Nakbe, do we have remains suggesting that these were anything more than simple peasants with a tribal level of organization. There was no writing, little that could be called architecture, and hardly any development of art. In fact, nothing but a rapidly mounting population would make us think that the Maya in this period were much different from their immediate ancestors. There was, however, something very different that had been taking place in Mexico, in the hot coastal plain of southern Veracruz and adjacent Tabasco. This was the developing Olmec civilization, which began in the early Preclassic, reached its peak toward the end of the middle Preclassic, and then collapsed as suddenly as did the Maya and at a much later time. So far, the oldest known Olmec site is San Lorenzo, lying near a branch of the Coatzacoalcos River in Veracruz. Excavated by a Yale expedition between 1966 and 1969, fully developed Olmec culture, represented typically by the giant basalt sculptures fashioned in a distinctive style, proved to date back to 1400 BC. By 1000 to 900 BC, San Lorenzo had been destroyed by an unknown hand, but during the forest centuries of its flood, Olmec influence emanating from this area was to be found throughout Mesoamerica, with the curious exception of the Mayan domain, perhaps because there were few Maya populations at the time sufficiently large enough to have interested the expanding Olmecs. During the Middle Preclassic, following the demise of San Lorenzo, the great Olmec center was La Venta, situated on an island in the midst of the swampy wastes of the lower Tonalá River, and dominated by a 100-foot-high, 30-meter mound of clay. Elaborate tombs and spectacular offerings of jade and serpentine figurines were concealed by various constructions, both there and at other Olmec sites. The Olmec art style was centered upon the representations of creatures which combined the features of a snarling jaguar with those of a weeping human infant. Among these were jaguars. Almost surely was a rain god, one of the first recognizable deities of the Mesoamerican pantheon. From the unity of the art style, from the size and beauty of the sculptured monuments, and from the massive scale of the public architecture, there can be no doubt that there was a powerful Olmec state on the Gulf Coast, which, even at this early time, was able to command enormous resources, both in manpower and in materials. More important to the study of the Maya, there are also good reasons to believe that it was the late Olmecs who devised the elaborate long count calendar. Whether or not one thinks of the Olmecs as the mother culture of Mesoamerica, the fact is that many other civilizations, including the Maya, were ultimately dependent on the Olmec achievement. This is especially true during the Middle Preclassic, when lesser peasant cultures away from the Gulf Coast were acquiring traits which had filtered to them from their more advanced neighbors. Just as in ancient Europe, barbarian peoples in the west and north eventually had the benefits of the achievements of the contemporaneous Bronze Age civilizations of the Near East. Olmec stone monuments lie scattered all along the Piedmont zone of the Pacific coast, from Chiapas as far southeast as El Salvador, so there can be little doubt that these people had intruded into that fertile zone during the early and middle Preclassic. There is even an Olmec rock painting in red and black pigments high on a cliff above Lake Amatitlan to the south of Guatemala City, showing an encounter between two helmeted dignitaries holding unidentifiable objects. It has recently been radiocarbon dated 1410 to between 1410 and 1120 BC, placing it on the same time level as San Lorenzo. Preclassic Kaminahuyu. One of the greatest of all archaeological sites in the New World is Kaminahuyu, on the western margins of Guatemala City in a broad, fertile valley lying athwart the continental divide. Although it consisted of several hundred great temple mounds in Maudslay's day, all but a handful have been swallowed up by the rapidly expanding slums and real estate developments of the capital. Rescue operations by the Carnegie Institution of Washington and Pennsylvania State University have shown that, whereas part of the site was constructed during the early Classic, the great majority of the mounds were definitely pre-Classic. The loss to science through the depredations of brickyards and bulldozers has been incalculable. It has been no easy task, under these circumstances, to work out an archaeological succession for Kaminahuyu, but the oldest culture probably is Arevalo, for which we have little more than some sherds from from tecumates and red slipped bowls. This is followed by Las Charcas, which marks a major occupation of the valley of Guatemala, for Las Charcas remains are scattered widely. Its stratigraphic position underneath the deposits of the late Preclassic, backed up by a number of slightly contradictory radiocarbon dates, suggests that this village culture falls toward the end of the Middle Preclassic, around the 5th or 4th century BC. The best preserved Las Charcas remains come from a series of bottle-shaped pits, which have been cut in ancient times down through the topsoil into the underlying volcanic ash. No one has a firm idea of the purpose of these excavations. Perhaps some may have been cooking pits, and it is entirely possible that, as among the historic Hidatsa Indians of the Great Plains, others may have been for the storage of maize and beans, but surely their final use was as refuse containers. In them has been found carbonized avocado seeds, maize cobs, and remnants of textiles, basketry, and probably mats, and rope fragments. The magnificent Las Charcas whiteware, manufactured from a kaolin-like clay, is extremely sophisticated, with designs in red showing spider monkeys with upraised arms, grotesque dragon masks, and other more extract motifs. Las Charcas figurines are predominantly female, with a liveliness of concept seldom found elsewhere. The Maya lowlands. In the Maya lowlands, both in the central and in the northern areas, we now have for the first time substantial evidence for a Maya population. One of the oldest Middle Preclassic cultures is the lowlands, is the little-known she phase of the western Peten, which appears in the deep levels at the site of Altar de Sacrificios and at Cebal, and may represent some kind of intrusion from the highlands via the Lacantum drainage system. While on the one hand, she ceramics are related to the Coeval hard, white pottery of Chiapas, there are ties with the Olmecs of the Gulf Coast, for at Cebal, Gordon Willey and his Harvard group found a cache of jade celts and a jade perforating instrument of probable La Venta manufacture. The spread of Mayan speakers in the Peten, Belize, and the northern Maya area is almost surely to be associated with the adoption of red and mottled orange ceramics, one of the earliest manifestations of which seems to be in the Swazi Bladen phase. At the site of Coelho in northern Belize, its excavator, Norman Hammond, once assigned it to the early Preclassic, but radiocarbon and comparative evidence places it at about 850 BC. In Swazi, deposits there have been preserved tiny cobs of popcorn and root crops such as native yam, cocoyam, xanthosoma, and possibly manioc. There is also some evidence of architectural beginnings, with plastered platforms that once supported perishable superstructures. Swazi Bladen leads directly into the Mamam culture, dated from 700 to about 400 BC. Mamam, or something like it, is spread over almost all the Maya lowlands and looks like a simple village culture, since until recently there were no real examples of public architecture on the scale of La Venta. For instance, however, the special conditions of excavation in the Peten must be considered. The lowland Maya almost always built their temples over older ones, so that in the course of centuries, the earliest constructions would eventually come to be deeply buried within the towering accretions of classic period rubble and plaster. Consequently, to prospect for Mamam temples in one of the larger sites would be extremely costly in time and labor. The recent discoveries by Richard Hansen at the northern Peten site of Nakbe, to be further considered in the next chapter, have drastically changed our minds about Mamam temple architecture. At first, no more than a large Middle Preclassic village by 750 BC, Nakbe had begun to look like a city, with buildings and platforms as high as 59 feet covering the old village structures. While these lack spectacular mask panels that were to be a hallmark of this and other cities in the late Preclassic, the Nakbe temples testify that the lowland Maya had begun to emerge at even this early date from simple peasant life to a more complex society. Mamam pottery appears quite simple when compared with Las Charcas, to which it seems related. The commonest wares are red and orange-red monochromes with polychrome decoration absent. Usually, the only embellishment is the simple incising on the inside of bowls or daubing of neck jars with red blobs. Nonetheless, new information from Nakbe suggests that this simplicity has been overstated. There, according to Dr. Hansen, up to 17% of Mamam ceramics recovered from this well-preserved context were waxy monochromes that had been covered with an extremely fine and delicate, brilliantly polychrome stucco. Such polychroming may have been present in other Peten sites, but inadvertently washed off in the laboratory. The figurine cult, if such it may be called, is present in Mamon, with a wide range of stylistic treatment carried out by punching and with applied strips of clay. At Tikal, a cache of Mamam ceramics was discovered in a sealed chotun. This was a bottle-shaped chamber below the plaza floor, quite comparable in shape and perhaps in use to those of Las Charcas. Chotunob are ubiquitous in sites of the central and northern areas, cut down into the limestone marl from the surface. We know that by the Classic, they were used as cisterns in the Pu'uk region, and in the central area for burials and perhaps sweat baths. Initially, they could have been utilized as sources of the fine lime employed in construction by Maya architects, but their use as storage pits, perhaps for the fruit of the bread nut tree, as suggested by Dennis Pulliston, should not be overlooked. However, they are often so damp that stored food may have rotted. Whatever the answer to the Chotun mystery, they are as old as the Mamam phase. But these early Maya did not live by bread alone. Many Middle Preclassic pottery vessels have sprouts like teapots, and while it was known that they were used for pouring liquids, exactly which liquids remain unknown, until Terry Powis of the University of Texas submitted residue from the inside of several vessels excavated at the northern Belize side of Kola for analysis at the Hershey Foods Technical Center. Dating from around 600 AD, chemist Jeffrey Hurst found traces of theobromine, an alkaloid distinctive of chocolate, the earliest use of this highly valued substance known, because later Mesoamericans highly prized the foam on the chocolate drink. Hurst speculates that the Kola villagers frothered up the liquid by blowing through the spout. In the southeastern corner of the central area, the pioneers who first settled in the rich valleys surrounding the ancient city of Copan had very different roots from Mamon. Towards the end of the early Preclassic, village cultures all along the Pacific littoral as far as El Salvador had become Olmecized, a tradition that was to continue into the Middle Preclassic and that was to be manifested in carved ceramics of Olmec type and even in Olmec stone monuments. This Olmec-like wave even penetrated the Copan Valley during the Middle Preclassic Uyghur phase, 900 to 400 BC, with the sudden appearance of pottery bowls incised and carved with such Olmec motifs as the pawing and the so-called flame eyebrows. In a deep layer of an outlying suburb of the classic city, William Fash discovered an Uriphase burial accompanied by Olmecoid ceramics, 9 polished stone cells, and over 300 drilled jade objects. Although the rest of the Maya lowlands seem to have been of little or no interest to the Olmec peoples, the Copan area definitely was. Jade was surely the compelling reason for this intrusion of the Olmec into what in later times was clearly the southeast frontier of the Maya area. It has been known for over 50 years that the classic Maya obtained their green and often dull-colored jade from alluvial deposits in the drainage of the Motagua River to the west of Copan, but this was not the distinctive blue-green jade so prized by the Olmec. The mystery of where the Olmec obtained this material has at long last been solved by the discovery in 2001 of several sources in the Sierra de las Minas, far above the Motagua, by a team including geophysicist Russell Seitz, mineralogist George Harlow, geologist Virginia Sisson, and anthropologist Carl Taub. Since then, subsequent expeditions have found not only workshop sites near these sources, but also, according to Tabe, fragments of Olmec pottery probably manufactured at Tlapacoya, an ancient Olmec center in the Valley of Mexico. Control of both the Motagua and Copan valleys would have given the Olmec a virtual monopoly of a material that was as important to this primordial civilization as gold was to be for the Spanish conquistadores. There is still a great deal to understand about the Middle Preclassic, the base on which the flowering of Maya culture took place. Certainly, it was during this period when the Maya became truly Maya. But Maya civilization as we know it, the vaulted masonry architecture, the naturalistic painting and relief style, the long count calendar and writing, had not even begun to germinate during this epoch. This concludes Chapter 2.